Hey everybody, welcome back. Just in case you weren't in my last session, my name is Warren Alexander O'Mara Dates. I am the founder CEO of the 652 Project Foundation, founded back in 2010 in Alabama. And I want to welcome you to this, the Racial Injustice and Meaningful Involvement of People Living with HIV, or better known as MIPA, training principles. This program is funded wholly or in part by the government of the District of Columbia, Department of Health, HIV/AIDS, Hepatitis, STI, and TB Administration, also known as HAHSTA. Our learning objectives for today's time together is one, we're going to learn the importance of integrating MIPA and racial justice principles into our HIV work. We're also going to discuss why just calling it MIPA and racial justice doesn't work. We're going to discuss practical ways to implement MIPA and racial justice into your organizations. And we're going to learn first steps to living these principles individually and within our organizations. Why don't we just jump right on in? So racial justice, HIV is a racial justice issue. Why does it matter? So I have a few questions that I wanted to pose to you all to see if we can spark some thinking as I go through the presentation today. So why does it matter? Are many of our organizations intentional about integrating racial justice principles in their work? If yes, then how? Let's ponder that thought for a second. Are many organizations intentional about integrating MIPA in its work? If yes, again, how? Ponder that thought. And do issues of race, racism, racial injustice impact your HIV work? If yes, how? While you're thinking about those three questions, I'll take a sip of water. What is race? I think we first have to understand the context of race before we can delve into any of the rest of the presentation, particularly because to many people, race means many different things. Here at the 652 Project Foundation, this is how we tend to look at the lens of race and how I as an individual tend to look at the lens of race. Usually it's thought of as being tied to a person's skin color, their eye shape, or other physical traits and or the region of origin in the world. It's also as much a social category as it's a biological one. And then lastly, I would say that race is a social construct that's designed to benefit people who are white, or approximate whiteness. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. We also have come to understand that there are levels to racism, and we've identified four. Here at the 652 Project Foundation. We like to talk about racism in the context of internalized, which is that we don't necessarily see on an everyday basis from people. The interpersonal relationship with others, structural racism, and then there's institutional racism. So HIV is a racial justice issue. Race typically mentioned when talking about data, not always solutions, is one of the ways that we see racial injustice showing up. We're collecting data from people, but not necessarily offering solutions to the data with the broader context of how that data influences the outcomes that we see with the demographics that we are capturing. Also shows up because our HIV epidemic is fueled by racial injustice because it disproportionately impacts people who look like me, Black and brown communities in particular. Especially in the South, we see right now that the largest numbers of new infection tends to happen in the Deep South. And we know that the Deep South is primarily where most of our Black and brown folks in this country live right now. Also, interventions are typically focused on behavior changes and don't always address the structural issues that happen within our organizations that cause individuals to adversely have outcomes to the things that we are trying to keep them from being affected by, and in this particular case, HIV. Then language is usually focused on blame and shame in our organizations because we know that, right, HIV is 100% preventable. And then lastly, racial disparities in access to care and power. In particular, we know that data has shown from the CDC that many communities of brown and Black origin tend to not have the same access to healthcare, to treatment, to providers for a myriad of reasons. One in particular that I can think of is in the South in particular, we based on things that happened at Tuskegee years ago. We have what we call the white coat syndrome. And so many times we don't trust the people that are in power that wear the white coats. Therefore, we don't access the care that we need to be able to make ourselves healthy and whole. And then also I would add these points of how racial injustice shows up in our HIV work. We tend to use stigmatizing language more often than not. And one of the things that I'm heavily focused on is, as we talked about in the previous presentation, using people first language is important. Making sure that we're not marginalizing people by how we categorize them. And one of the ways that we look at that is by using high risk categories. Well, we're all at risk. So who's really at higher risk than anyone else? But when we talk about Black and brown communities, many times we use the term high risk over those of our white counterparts. We tend to see that our staffing and our board of directors doesn't reflect the communities of people that we serve. More often than not, they're the last to be called to the table in administration, in leadership, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Then there's the microaggression or use of code. Those people would be an example of that, right? Then our policies and our practices tend to not mirror how Black and brown communities organize, how they interact. And so when we institute policies and practices that don't welcome them into our space and our everyday work, then they tend not to want to come back to us when they really need to access our care. Our programs, their mission and their vision oftentimes are not, Black and brown communities are not consulted with respect to how they're laid out. They're generally handed a program and told how it will work versus giving input and how it should be framed and how it should work. Therefore, we then get the outcomes that we're expecting. And then there's that implicit bias that we all have. We all have been born into lives where we don't necessarily get to determine the things we learn early on. And so we have instituted in us family backgrounds, religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds that sometimes cause us to have our own internal implicit bias. And then we focus many times on behavior of individuals, Black and brown communities and people at risk for HIV transmission. Top management is not reflective of people of color or communities being served. For example, if you are serving the trans community, but no one in top management is a person of trans lived experience or GNC lived experience, then how would you expect and why would you expect that trans communities would then want to access the care that you're providing? And then lastly, coalitions led by all non-people of color folks or non-community folks. We have these Ryan White planning councils, for example. We have community advisory boards, for example, but more often than not, the people that we put in place to serve as president or vice president or chair or co-chair are typically not the people of the communities that we're primarily serving. And so we want to talk about now how we can meaningfully engage people living with HIV in our move forward. We understand that we've learned a lot from the last 30 plus years of having this epidemic in this country. And one of the things that we know is that in the early 80s, there was the ACT UP movement. And the ACT UP movement, white, gay-loving, or same-gender-loving men got tired of not being represented and not having policies and things in place that caused them to write what we now know as their Bill of Rights called the Denver Principles, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. But I want to kind of give you that background, history, and context because that's where MIPA was born. It stands for Meaningful Involvement of People Living with HIV/AIDS. And now there is also an organization globally called GIPA, which is a greater involvement of people living with HIV. And these are some of my friends around the globe who are a part of that movement. GIPA means meaningfully involving people with HIV in the programmatic, the policy, and funding decisions and actions that impact our lives by ensuring that we participate in important decisions. And this is important to me, particularly because, yes, I am a person living with HIV. I was diagnosed November 2nd, 2009, duly diagnosed with HIV and AIDS at the time, and was told that I would only have 8 days to live. We're now having this conversation on my 10-year anniversary of being alive and well and living healthy as an undetectable person living with HIV. And so the Denver Principles that I talked about, if you've never read them, I would strongly encourage you to Google them and look at them. But you'll see here on my screen, I kind of gave you an overview. I call it the 30,000 feet view, if you will. The Denver Principles was a statement from the Advisory Committee of People with AIDS. And it simply says, we condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat, and we are occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS. And out of that manifesto were born very critical recommendations that I'd like to point out here, 3 of which we said, in order for us to be able to end the epidemic of HIV, and we're still fighting that now, these things must be important. We must form caucuses to choose our own representatives, to deal with the media, to choose our own agenda, and to plan our own strategies. We must be involved at every level of decision making. And specifically, we have to serve on the boards of directors of provider organizations. And we know those to be AIDS service organizations or community-based organizations, right? We have to be included in all AIDS forums with equal credibility as other participants to share our own experiences and our knowledge. Because we know, medically speaking, there are trained professionals. We know that there are MDs, there are PAs, there are nurse practitioners, there are nurses, there are frontline staff, there are social workers. Many of you have studied your profession, and we certainly respect the training that you have, but the lived experience and the lived narrative of someone who lives with HIV is just as important a conversation and a training as anyone could have if they attended someone's medical school. So why, again, does MIPA matter? Those most impacted by a decision should lead the decision making. I mean, it kind of goes back to one of those scenarios where you were in college. It wasn't so fun when administration would say to you, these are the events that you're going to have, but we're not going to let you have a part of the planning of those events. So you never really wanted to attend those things. Same scenario here. We know that better decisions come as an outcome of responsive planning, and that's because we include communities in that process. Real connection to community comes from involving people living with HIV. We know our friends, we know our colleagues in the business, and we can better communicate to each other because we understand the lived experience that we have. We know that when we include people in the community, that we tend to see a reduction in stigma and discrimination because there's an openness for people to be able to disclose when they feel comfortable, but it also allows them to be able to talk about the anxiety sometimes that comes with living with a disease that we have been told is terminal, that we've been told we can't survive from in some cases. And so when we involve community in conversations, we can then help them better cope with their stigma around having the disease once they acquire it. And then it increases our effectiveness of policies and programs when we have people sitting at the table that are living with HIV. And then lastly, what we all want in our organizations is we want to build sustainability and we want to have shareable power within the community because we're all in this thing together. And without each other, there is no way that we will ever be able to end the HIV epidemic as a community. So now it's your turn. I'm going to pause here and let you think, what's not MIPA? Have you had some scenarios in your organization where you can think that you have not been MIPA compliant, so to speak? I'll give you a moment to think about that. All right. So now let me tell you some of the examples that we have that we like to point out that's not MIPA. Permanent volunteerism. You know, we always ask community to come in and help us do condom packs. We want them to take surveys and we want them to be a part of focus groups. But we always ask for that time for free. Well, just like you go to work and you get paid, asking us about our lived experience, asking us about things that are happening in the community and on the ground is just as valuable the information as you're sharing as a professional. So we need to get away from this business of specific cards to specific um, stores that community may or may not actually go to. I, for example, am not a big Walmart shopper. I tend to shop online. So if you're not giving me an Amazon gift card for my time, then you're really not valuing my time. And the only way we get away from that is asking community to be involved in what it is that they're wanting when we are going to incentivize them for their input. Meeting times being set for folks when they can't make it. Operations of organizations happen more often than not, 8 to 5. Well, there are a lot of people living with HIV who still work. And if you're asking them to participate in your organization, if you're having a meeting at noon, but for their having to take their lunch break to come to your meeting, they can't be there. So you're really already discounting them when you organize your meeting at noon. So think about non-traditional ways of how you can involve people that you're serving, be it that you have meetings after hours or that you have teleconference meetings, but the face-to-face is not always the right choice. And then there's the community panel. The only time that you want to involve people living with HIV is when you want to basically focus on us for others to see the work that you're doing on the external front. Invitations to be the, quote, face of a campaign. If you're asking for this beautiful face to serve on posters that you're utilizing in the community, there's a lot of weight that comes with that. And to be able to ask someone to offer up their face or their likeness, yet you're not willing to compensate them for that, not so much. Getting information that we don't have time to process. We oftentimes ask information of community members. We don't explain why. We don't tell them the outcomes of their information and their input. And then when we gather the information, oftentimes we don't share results. Well, then why does that encourage community to want to continue being a part of your process of writing for grants, public events, and things of that nature? And then race, gender, and class neutral people living with HIV representation. Oftentimes when we look at leadership and we talk about diversity and inclusion, and in this context of time that we live in America right now, we know that racial inequality has been alive and well for over 400 years, right? Talking about that approximating whiteness from the beginning of time when America became who she is over 200 years ago. We know that people of color have never been valued to their full capacity. And so when you start to look at the context of how you're operating daily, are you really equitable when it comes to the race of individuals in your organization, the genders of people in your organization, and are you welcoming people who may or may not be financially sound in your community? So how then can we make organizations better? And I like to call this MIPA in action. As a kid, I oftentimes was told by my parents and by my mentors that your words are nice, but your actions are so much better. People will believe what they see far more than they'll believe what they hear. So these are ways that we want to offer up to you that you can include MIPA and racial justice in your organizations. Commit to integrating MIPA and racial justice principles. Make it a policy statement. Say that you are going to intentionally include people living with HIV in everything that you do, from the time you get started as an organization all the way up until the day we hope this epidemic ends and we have to close down as organizations. Be explicit about your commitment to MIPA and racial justice. Don't just let it be an internal conversation, but make sure the community around you knows that you're committed to racial justice and MIPA principles. Look at your staff chart. Again, talking about making sure we have equity around the people that we serve. Are we making sure that we have women? Are we making sure that we have people of color? Are we making sure we have people of LGBTQIA+ community representation? Are we talking about making sure that we have people who are living with HIV represented on our boards and on our staff organizations? And then look at how power and decision-making influences your day-to-day work. We talked about in the previous presentation that I did, the power differential that we oftentimes see exposed in organizations simply because that's what systems have been set up like in this country. Reserve minimum percentage of seats on your governance board. If I happen to look at your organization and I look at your board of governance and I don't see somebody who looks like me, I'm more often than not gonna want to do business with you unless it's to influence you to make a change for the better. Because I think unless we're diverse in how we're organized and how we're governing ourselves, then we truly can't say we're an organization that's serving the greater good of society. Because we know that society is a complexity, right? There's people of all shades, shapes, sizes, colors, backgrounds. And if your governance board looks like one group, then more than likely, you're not really up to speed with what society really should expect of you. Restructure representation to be accountable to the community. If your community can't safely say things about how you're operating and the programs that you're providing to them without fear of retribution, then you're not a MIPA organization. Create protocols to take information from constituents safely. To that point, don't just always assume that when someone wants to give a response, that they want to give one face to face. In the age of technology, where there is an opportunity for someone to have a cell phone, create a survey online that doesn't have identifiers, that truly is anonymous, for people to be able to give their input, because we know when they safely can do so, they're more apt to want to be a part of what we're asking of them. And then expand involvement beyond your go-to HIV leadership. You know, picking and choosing one or two people to speak for the community of women living with HIV, or trans folk living with HIV, or same gender loving men living with HIV. If you've got that one person, I call them the token, that you always go to, then you're really not looking at your constituency and valuing the entire constituency. Build leadership and power within your constituents. And the ways that we recommend that you're able to do that is, one, if they don't have the skill set, build them up, educate them, give them professional development opportunities, teach them advocacy and leadership training. Not all of us were afforded the opportunity to go to college, but many of us have the ability to advocate for ourselves. We just need the tools to do so. Then give us technical skills training and support by way of computer access, program software trainings, resume building. I'll give a shameless plug. As many years as I've been in this business and in the corporate sector, As much as I love office software, Excel is not my friend. So oftentimes I have to brush up on Excel. You may have that challenge as well. Well, if I've been educated and have been exposed to it over the years, imagine how the people that you have coming into your business or your organization that you're serving, they may feel intimidated as well. Oftentimes they may not access jobs, not because they don't want to work, but it's because they feel like they're not educated and informed enough to be able to. And so offering those tools so that they are able to do that makes them feel more whole and welcomed into your organization. And then mentorship. I am so big on mentoring others. We have an obligation as human beings, I think, as people in this world to help others. And so if we're not making mentorship an integral part of our leadership, then we're failing society already, because the goal is always to train people to replace us. We're not expecting, I know I'm not, to be working the rest of my life. And so if I'm not mentoring others to take my place and to take my seats at these tables that I'm afforded, then guess what? The organization doesn't continue to grow. And then lastly, I acknowledge that stigma is multi-layered. It's not one size fits all. Stigma looks different for different people, and it feels different for different people. Be intentional about who speaks for a community. Not everyone has the same voice, has the same lived narrative. Not everybody has the same professional success. So be intentional about who you call upon to speak for a community. Ensure that practices are in place to support our trans and our gender nonconforming folks on our staff. Make sure that they are not singled out simply because people may visibly see them different. Because we know that trans and GNC folk are people too. And when possible, oh my God, everybody needs to be paid. Everybody. I say when possible, but everybody deserves to be paid for their time, because everybody's time is valuable. And then let's remember, we have got to get away from stigmatizing and coded language in our organizations. We talk about the language that's on surveillance forms, for example. And many times when we see those forms, they're oftentimes words that sometimes can be stigmatizing to a community. And so therefore they feel that they are being asked things that they may or may not want to share. So having an opportunity to talk to community and asking them what it is that they want from you outside of the realms of what your funders are asking is so integral. And so at this time, I'm going to pause our conversation in hopes that you may have some questions. And this really concludes all the information that I have to share. And I just want to say how wonderful it's been to have this time with you. And we hope that in the future, if you have needs, that you would feel free to reach out to the 652 Project Foundation for your needs. And to me personally, again, I'm Warren O'Mara Dates, and I'll take any questions at this time.